It's the summer of 1816, and Mary Shelley and her friends are on holiday in Switzerland. It's not much of a summer though. In fact, lots of people now refer to 1816 as the year without a summer. Temperatures plummeted worldwide. There was frost, snow, and excessive rain in much of Europe, to the extent that many died of hunger as a result of ensuing food shortages. Most people recognise that it was probably due to volcanic activity the year before in Indonesia. In fact, it sounds like a pretty horrific year for many people, but it seems to have given us at least one thing: Frankenstein. Shelley and her chums understandably stayed indoors, and in an attempt to keep themselves entertained, set themselves the challenge of who could write the scariest story. This was where Frankenstein was born. But that's by no means the only thing about the context that's important. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, Gothic literature was very popular. Stories to terrify you and shock you with their ghosts and vampires, death and romance. With its focus on death and evil, its mysterious and often dark and gloomy landscapes, its sensational events and its ability to grip you with a mixture of thrill, horror and danger, Frankenstein certainly ticks a lot of those Gothic boxes. If you look at Shelley's introduction to the 1831 edition of the novel, for instance, you'll see that her intention was to curdle the blood and quicken the beatings of the heart. Look at the night on which the creature comes to life, for instance. It's described as a dreary night of November, right at the beginning of the chapter, a suitably Gothic setting. A scientist called Luigi Galvani was another possible trigger. He was experimenting on dissected animals and found that when he touched a frog's legs with a copper probe and a piece of iron at the same time, they jerked as if they were connected to electricity. This is what we call Galvanism, and Shelley herself admitted that it was one of the sparks that lit up the possibility of Frankenstein in her mind. Electricity is a recurring element in the novel, of course. In chapter 2, for instance, Victor says the thunder burst at once with frightful loudness from various quarters of the heavens. Or look at the night of the monster's creation, when Victor uses electricity to infuse a spark of being into the lifeless corpse. Body snatching was also pretty common in the early 19th century. Until the Anatomy Act of 1832, the only way doctors and scientists could get hold of bodies to dissect and examine for medical reasons was through the courts. In other words, the bodies of criminals condemned to death. The problem was that there obviously weren't enough people committing murder, or at least getting caught, to supply all of their needs. So what did they do? Well, they went to their nearest graveyard, of course, the best place to get a fresh supply of newly buried bodies. Go for a fun walk next weekend to your nearest graveyard. At some cemeteries, you can even see watchtowers that were built to oversee graves in the hope of deterring the body snatchers, or resurrectionists as they were sometimes called. You might also find iron bars called mort safes over graves, another attempt to keep the buried. You don't have to look far in Frankenstein, of course, to find evidence of body snatching. In chapter 4, for instance, Victor says, "Darkness had no effect upon my fancy. A churchyard was to me merely a receptacle of bodies deprived of life, which from being the seat of beauty and strength had become food for the worm. Now I was led to examine the cause and progress of this decay, and forced to spend days and nights in vaults and charnel houses." Shelley's novel reflects contemporary attitudes to body snatching when Victor's work is described as odious and filthy. A couple of useful single-word quotes for you to remember there. What's even more fascinating, though, is that Victor Frankenstein is, of course, studying anatomy, and it's his creation, monster or creature, who then delivers a fair collection of bodies to him. His brother, his friend, his wife eventually. Is there a sense in which Shelley is presenting Victor as a resurrectionist, desperate for human corpses, who in some weirdly sinister or at least ironic way finds them delivered to him through the murders of his own family members? Finally, the setting. Gothic novels are often set in weird and wonderful, far-flung and mysterious places, and Frankenstein is no exception. Right from the outset, we travel with Robert Walton towards the North Pole, to the extremity of the world, a desolate place of wilderness and isolation. When he says in his first letter that he's already far north of London, Shelley is emphasising the distance of the action from the location of her readers. Look at where the rest of the novel is set: Switzerland, Germany, the Orkney Islands, hardly locations most of Shelley's readers would have been familiar with in pre-EasyJet days. The settings are meant to evoke a sense of romantic awe and Gothic fear and tension. Who knows what dangers you might encounter if you travel far enough north? If you go too far, you might even get stuck in the ice, experience the horror that Robert Walton and his men experienced. Maybe Shelley is suggesting that you can go too far, search too far, reach too far, and sometimes it's time to turn back. When you're surrounded by ice which closes in on the ship on all sides, as Walton's is, perhaps you need to listen to the wild, rambling warnings of a man whose life seems to have taken a wrong turn somewhere along the line.